Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to the Frontline, a virtual town hall of pandemic mental health impact, a World Insight special production on COVID-19. I'm your host, Tian Wei. Good to see you once again. Fear about the coronavirus has gripped the world. There are growing signs of anxiety. As I speak, more than 210,000 people have died from the virus and more than 3 million people have become sick. Hundreds of millions of people have been told to stay at home and limit their contact with the others. So how are people around the world adjusting to the new way of life? How to maintain our mental health during a global pandemic? Today, we are joined by a group of young people from different parts of the world. So are experts from around the world. They're here to share with us their insights and to share with us some of the most important experiences. Our guests will explain how to calm our anxiety during the pandemic and discuss the psychological effects of being quarantined. Let's meet the experts first. In Beijing, Han Buxin, president of Chinese Psychological Society. In Scottsdale, Arizona in the U.S., Catherine Scheer, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. She's also the founding director of the Center for Complicated Grief at the university. In Calgary, Li Xiaomao, provisional registered psychologist in private practice. In Toronto, Canada, Roger McIntyre, professor of psychiatry and pharmacological studies at the University of Toronto. What a pleasure to see all of you. I know while you are coping with it personally, you're also trying to help others. So tell me, if we can, one by one, about where you're researching on and what do you think are the most important advice we should keep in mind. Let's start from Toronto. Professor McIntyre.
Well, you cited some statistics with respect to the number of people we know to be affected by the COVID-19 as well as the deaths. And we've been talking a lot about flattening the curves. What we need to talk about is preventing the curves, the curve of suicide and the curve of mental illness that's associated with suicide, like depression, a variety of anxiety-related conditions, including post-traumatic stress, which is related to anxiety, as well as alcohol-related problems. The world has never witnessed a triple threat quite like this. The triple threat is the biomedical threat of the virus. Secondly, it is the financial insecurity and the employment insecurity as a consequence of the government reaction to this. And thirdly is the quarantine measures. Whether we're talking about the anxiety of the virus, whether we're talking about income and employment insecurity, and or we're talking about quarantine, all of these are hazardous to brain health. We know from history, whether we go back to the SARS epidemic, which affected Toronto more than any other city outside Asia, we witnessed hazardous effects of, for example, quarantine, high rates of depression, post-traumatic stress, and substance abuse. So we've said a lot about healthcare providers. I'm a healthcare provider. I work frontline. This is a very difficult time. But it's also very difficult for a lot of other groups in society, like those who have mental illness, those who are on the fringe of society because of economics, and certainly the general population at large.
Right. It's very important you talk about the three areas, about the virus, about the economic realities, and also about the quarantine life. That's having huge impact on people's mental health. I want to go to you also, Professor Scheer from Arizona. Tell me more about what you are looking at most closely.
So my work, actually, though I'm physically in Arizona, my work is all at Columbia University in New York City. That's one of the quirks, I guess, of our current world, is that we often are in more than one place at a time. And I certainly think that these triple threat, as my colleague defined them, are highly important. But I would like to add to that, and something that is almost always neglected in the mental health field, and kind of surprisingly so, and that is the fact that more than millions of people are dying from this virus as well. And they're, in addition to the people that are dying, when people die, they leave behind bereaved people who suffer enormously and who have a very high rate of mental disorders, particularly when the death occurs in the way that it does with this virus. So that's my work centers on helping people who really can't get past grief. So that's what I do. That's what I've done for many, many years now. And it's what I'm doing now. And I think it's really important to add that to the list of things to be concerned about with this virus.
That's right. Professor Scheer, if I could just follow up very briefly. So what do you think are some of the most important tools we could have in mind when deal with the grief? Because we might all have somebody
the most important tool
that we know who are experiencing this difficulty at home or in the workplace. So what would be the best way to deal with it now?
Well, I think in the beginning, when you lose someone close, it's going to be essentially, it's like an earthquake, really, that kind of shakes the very foundation of your being. We typically experience acute grief that is something that surprises many people in its forcefulness and the way that it can take over our lives. And then we move through that by basically finding a way to really accept the reality of that loss, because it's not easy to do that in the beginning. And then we also have to kind of regroup and move forward, sort of restore a sense of well-being ourselves. And that can happen in a variety of ways. So the main thing is to understand that this is all very natural and to allow yourself to grieve in the way that you need to. So I can say more about that later, but that's the main thing.
A lot of things we have to deal with. And also in China, even though the curve have already flattened, in fact, the country has almost going to the normalcy, quote unquote, there are a lot of psychological burdens everyone here is trying to deal with. So on that, I want to come to Mr. Li, since you are working I want to go to the Chinese guest, Mr. Han. Since you are in Beijing, I'm sure you know about the city just opened up. People are celebrated online. But, after this exhilaration, people are going to go back to what they experienced over the past 100 days and more. So, Mr. Han, tell me more about that.
Well, thank you for collecting us. I hope you can hear me. My apology for the poor quality Wi-Fi in my home. But if you don't mind, I clear.
Well, having some difficulties reaching to Mr. Han, particularly through video. So let me go to you, Xiao Mao, Miss Li, who is right now in Calgary. Miss Li, can you hear me? Are you still with us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful.
Clearly.
If we could have you on the screen, it would be perfect. So tell me more about how you are doing it, because you're doing the private practice. What are the patients you are facing, and what are the stories you're hearing, and what do you think, how you can relate to your earlier colleagues who are talking about grief and also 3 layers of psychological pressure to deal with?
Yeah, and because I work at private practice, so my experience is that everyone is affected. And what my client told me is always about the coronavirus. And in the past, typically when we greet, we would have an update about people's life. How was your mood in the past week? But currently, whenever we greet each other, and people would mention, they learn or heard something about the coronavirus news and the worry about their family. So the entire conversation kind of changed and towards in that direction. And for clients, it is a very difficult time for them because when they seek psychotherapy or psychocounseling, they already have so many things on their plate. So the coronavirus just added another thing to worry. in their plate. So it would cause them more stress and very difficult to cope. And they may encounter insurance issues, financial issues, losing their jobs, and some of them would mention they don't trust of the online therapy. And if they have family members at home, it is very difficult for them to be open and to communicate with a therapist,
Right.
because they worry their family members would hear them. And some of them would also mention and they worry about their family members. They not only about themselves getting the virus, but also about what if my family member get the virus? How can I best support them? So it is very difficult taking care of so many things in their lives already, and at the same time they have to learn how to build
Right.
up their ones and be connected with other people and learn the ability to cope.
Well, it's easier said than done, isn't it? We could line up this laundry list of things that they can do, but however, how to do it, that's usually the most difficult part. I will have all of you to explain about that. But first of all, let's go to Professor Scheer. Since you're working in New York, and New York is what place of epicenter for the United States. Now we see the number is going still high. Flattening the curve, that has been achieved, but the number is still going up. And we all know things are still going exponentially. So, in the middle of all of this, what do you think are the things that people could do in order to calm down and face the reality to be the first step?
So I think it's very important to recognize that feeling anxiety and feeling lonely and some of the difficult feelings that we have in our lives are natural in this circumstance. And and the main thing is to be, well, two things: to be compassionate to oneself in feeling these things, so not to layer on, so to speak, some kind of judgment about whether, what are you feeling, what you should be feeling, are you feeling, should you not have these feelings? And then also to, at the same time, to stay kind of in the moment and not to overdo it either, not to sort of just catastrophize about all the things that could go wrong, really to try to stay in the present and to remember that even though things are still not looking so good in New York, they are better than they were a few weeks ago. And that's the general pattern. We will get through this, and we need to support one another, and that's going on. There's a lot of that going on, and we need to reach out to other people to be of help to them and to let them help us.
Can you give us some examples? One example that you have been dealing with, you don't have to reveal the name or the location, but rather, one specific example that would help us a lot. Please, Professor.
So, well, one specific example was trying to comfort someone, to help someone with grief who had lost so this is an older woman whose child was a healthcare worker and basically a healthy person, and did develop the virus, and needed to be hospitalized, and told her mother that she shouldn't worry because she was going to be fine. And actually, what ultimately happened was she wasn't fine. In fact, she ended up dying, and of course dying alone in the hospital. And this mother is just really, just devastated by this loss.
And therefore, how would you be able to provide support to the mother?
Well, you can't change the reality, right? And that's all she really wants. In the beginning, that's all anybody really wants. So all you really can do is be present and listen and share in the heartbreak. It's a heartbreaking story, and there's nothing to do but share in the heartbreak. And we all have to share in it.
Be a good listener. It's almost an important skill for my profession, but at this time it's a necessity for everyone for the care of the others. Let me go to you also, Professor McIntyre. we have been seeing healthcare workers on the very front line dealing with the death of their patients and the incapability of their trade to deal with the pandemic in such a scale. And we also have been hearing even suicidal stories of these doctors and healthcare workers. Now, for them, what are some of the things they need to bear in mind? And also for the others who are dealing with them, whether families, acquaintances, or colleagues, what are some of the things we need to bear in mind?
Well, I think the comments about bereaved or people who've gone through loss and of a loved one is, in many ways, there's a lot of similarities. I think we're talking about a stressor, and the healthcare providers are now being subjected to, death and loss of patients. Mm-hmm. There's also the fear they might contract the virus and pass it on to their patients. This is something that's been expressed to me by some colleagues that work in my hospital. There's also, in many cases, depends on which part of the world, but many healthcare providers are being asked to work in areas that they're not experts in because there's been the need to redeploy some of the human resources. And the other aspect about this I think we need to be sensitive to is the gender effect. According to the World Health Organization, 80% of the world's healthcare workforce is women. Yeah. And I think that's something we need to be very sensitive to as well. I think women are carrying a disproportionate amount of this burden. So I think that one aspect about myself, and I've noticed throughout my career as a healthcare provider, is we very often rely on our colleagues, not just to discuss difficult situations and cases, but also for support. But what's different now is that healthcare providers are being asked to, in case, quarantine or socially distance, certainly physically distance themselves, not just from their colleagues, but also from their families. And many families or healthcare providers are not even staying at their homes with their families out of concern that they might be affected and not know it. So look, this is obviously a difficult time, but I want to be very clear. There are solutions, and there are proactive solutions, things we can do now. And some of the basics make a difference, like having structure to your day. We just finished a study in the south of China, which it's going to come out in press in the American Journal of Psychiatry in a few weeks. And we looked at healthcare providers, and it won't surprise you that they had a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. But here's what was interesting: portion control. We found that healthcare providers that spent too much time watching TV 3, 4, 5 hours a day, or too much time on social media 3, 4, 5 hours a day, reported much higher degrees of stress and anxiety. So portion control usually means food and alcohol consumption. It also means news media and social media consumption. And we think this, along with accurate information, getting good sleep and exercise, are all ways to build your resiliency and maintain contact with your colleagues through the technology platforms.
Structured life is extremely important for ordinary days, and particularly for the days when we have to deal with pandemic. What you have just said is so true, that the media and also the public domain and platform not only should be about the latest news, but also to provide health advice and support to our viewers. That's exactly what we are trying to do. And by the way, we've been having our viewers trying to write in and also post their comments on our YouTube channels, Twitter and Facebook accounts. And so please do so, continue to do so. I want to read one coming from Glory. Spring Morning Glory, I guess that's probably a name used online. Yet again, thank you to all frontliners, all frontline responders for fighting and protecting the country and people amid the epidemic. And now we know it's a pandemic, so we want to thank you as well. This is one of our viewers writing in. Having said that, though, let me go to Mr. Han in Beijing. I know the video could be a little bit difficult, but would you like to help us to understand what's going on here in China? Because it was first in the fire and almost the first coming out of the fire compared to the other peer countries. So now, where is it? What are some of the biggest psychological difficulties the population is dealing with?
Thank you. Given that this is in China, the pandemic has get into second phase, so psychological reaction has been emerged. For psychologists in China, the first priority is to find those really in need, especially for those workers in frontier and in frontline, medical doctors, nurses, and also community workers, patients, and their relatives, especially those relatives with they lost their beloved ones.
So tell me, because China experiences in a different way. You see, the other outbreaks are mainly countries having explosive outbreaks almost all over, but China has a very different reality. For example, the epicenter Wuhan, that's where most of the lives lost. That's where almost the majority of the cases are confirmed. But the rest of China was, in a way, looking at Wuhan and also worry about what they are trying to deal with. So this is a very different reality than some of the other countries where they have outbreaks in different parts of the map. So what does that mean, Mr. Han, for people inside Wuhan, the epicenter, and for people outside Wuhan? I guess it's very different stories.
Well, we psychologists found the phenomenon called typhoon, psychological typhoon eyes reaction to the crisis like this. This has been in the last time when the Wenchang earthquake. People living in the epicenter are not really actually react as anxiety as people expected, because they experience the crisis already. They know the reality, rather than outside the epicenter. For example, people living in Beijing, they just know the news from the media. So their mental and behavioral reaction may be severe than, negative reaction may be severe than those living epicenter.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Well, for this pandemic, I think the complying to the conformity, lockdown and quarantine, staying home, is kind of for basic protection, either for personal, for the family, or for others. So this is very important.
Yes, indeed. We're going to hear some of the stories later in our program. You're watching our special production, World Insight special production, The Frontline. Today we're dealing with the psychological trauma that we are all facing today as a result of COVID-19. And our world, as many of our experts already illustrated, experiencing an extraordinary health emergency, and it may lead to long-term psychological problems. Well, so what steps can be taken to help bereaved, in a way, families and beloved ones, and how can they manage their grief as they begin their difficult times? Let's take a look at this package.
Psychologists explain that there is a peak and a valley response in our nerve system when faced with trauma. Right now, we are at the peak, in which we are engaging with the immediate threat of the pandemic. You go into survival mode, which can be very taxing on a person's mental health. Once the pandemic is over, there will be a valley where we recover from that threat. But the problem is, going back to the baseline without support can take a lot longer than we may think. After the threat passes, people can start to retreat or fall into depression, or find many other ways of disassociating themselves with the trauma they experienced.
That's an interesting roundup. You're watching our special program, The Frontline, a virtual town hall on pandemic mental health impacts. Stay with us. We'll be back after this. And clinician. The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. You're watching The Frontline, a virtual town hall of pandemic mental health impact, the World Insight special production on COVID-19. We're in a way live streaming and on Facebook, Twitter, and also Sina Weibo. We would love to hear from you and also your opinions, your comments, your questions. So join us by commenting your thoughts, and we'd like to pass on your questions to our guests as well. Now, I would like to invite more to come into this conversation. This is a virtual town hall, pandemic mental health impact. We are joined now, several of those people we've been in contact with over the past week or so. They've been telling us their stories, and let's also hear their stories. We're joined by, in Shenzhen, Chen Liang, admission counselor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen. In Tampa, Florida, we have Eli Zhang, a news design director. And also in Dallas, we have William Rottenthaler, who is a PhD candidate of Chinese history. Good to have all of you. Want to start by Mr. Rottenthaler. Tell me more about your story and what kind of help you would like to seek from our experts today.
Well, my story begins with that at the beginning of this pandemic, my wife and child and I were separated. I was in school in Vancouver, Canada, and my wife was here in Dallas, and our child was in Las Cruces, New Mexico with the grandparents. And so we were all separated during the beginning of this. And so we were very anxious about how we would see each other as travel bans began to be enforced, as work began to be lost. My wife works in the airline industry, and so her job has been up in the air for the past few weeks and months. And so she didn't know what was going to happen. And it took a while for my school in Canada to shut down campus and allow students to go back home. And this was around the time that, right the day before that, Canada had shut down the border with the US. And so we were very anxious about me getting home. And once I got home to Dallas, just spending those 2 weeks in self-isolation with my wife before we got to go and pick up our child in New Mexico. And so just the prolonged separation that we had to deal with from one another. So just dealing with these kinds of issues of separation and not being able to be with family and loved ones, because my wife has been affected by it very much, since the majority of her family is in China.
So how would you try to deal with it at the time? You know, how did you manage to deal with it? And what do you think you can do better? And which part of the advice you would like to hear from our experts, or you would like to tell our experts this is the way to go? Either, please help us to understand why you are here today.
Well, it was just what had been mentioned earlier about reducing presence and being online, social media, and being caught in this very anxiety-inducing news cycle, in which we're constantly reading about the increasing number of deaths and these sometimes very callous government responses that have been taking place all over the world, and how it, in our case, between my wife and I, we would converse with each other via FaceTime daily after reading hours and hours of news about the pandemic, and we would inevitably break out into arguments just because we were so nervous about what was happening, and why wasn't I in Dallas and so forth, and why should she still be working, and so just like dealing with this, building structure into our day, so that we can have communication but not be overwhelmed with information about the pandemic.
I guess it's a saga story of one family, but that story has been repeated in so many different versions by families around the world as a result of this pandemic. Professor McIntyre, since you earlier have been talking about this, I want you to comment on what you have just said, what you have just heard.
Well, I think that the aspect about contagion usually means virus, but contagion also means the negative and often misinformation that is quite frequently encountered, for example, in various platforms. My colleague in Arizona had spoken moments ago about loneliness, and I was really glad she brought that up because we are witnessing a loneliness epidemic globally. This is predating the COVID-19 situation. And it's very, very serious. It's common and serious and probably increasing and affecting the entire age trajectory, with some groups affected more than others. And why I bring that up, or why I revisit that, it was already brought up, is because we now know from separate lines of research that there seems to be a relationship between the extent to which people are spending time on social media, various platforms, and the degree to which they rate themselves as lonely. Now, there's in the research community, we're still trying to sort out what came first, and and is this really a causative relationship or not? But notwithstanding, we do know that, again, it goes back to how I metaphorically used the words portion control. And we found, and I said in our study in China, in healthcare providers as well as the general population, those who kept their exposure to social media much less and their exposure to news media much less were reporting their depression and anxiety and stress much lower. Now, some people might say, well, but isn't there a confound? Maybe they're spending less time on social media because they actually have people that they live with and they have close social contacts. And they're all very good points. What we need during these times is we need meaningful interpersonal connection. Often it's going to be technology. And the anonymity, the anonymous connections that are commonly available on these social platforms is not how the brain was wired. Human beings have evolved not to spend time with strangers. We spend time with those we know, those we trust, those we feel safe with. And that actually is playing a trick on us, what social media is offering. So this is something that we're still trying to understand it. But what we do know is that it's already been shown that to help if you spend less time on these platforms.
However, there's a thing, Mr. Han, if I could. The world now, it's about being informed through social media. And we do want to be informed constantly at a time of a pandemic because things could change, things could happen to people around us, and things could happen to the city and the locality where we are. And they're all coming from social media these days, a lot of times, or from media like the traditional media, so-called TVs, but you still need to have it on or on your smartphone. So the question is, how can you make that balance of constant checking for the latest, but at the same time, keep your health, mental health? That is always a mind-boggling question. Secondly, just Zoom conferences like this. Every one of us, I'm sure today, have been participating 1 or 2 or even 3 or maybe 4 or 5 of them every day. This is what we have to do during the pandemic time. We have to have social distancing, but this is not real person to person. Professor Scheer, I want to hold your hand and ask you questions. Mr. McIntyre, I want to shake your hands and after that asking your question. And Mr. rotten tally, I want to say hi to your family, knock on your door, see your kid. I want to kiss him or her while I'm talking to you. But this is not possible these days. So we have to use these tools, but at the same time, we need to make sure we need to be aware of the nature of it. So how to do that? This is mind-boggling. Mr. Han, you are looking down. I hope you are having an answer for us. Mr. Han, very calm right now. Maybe we're having some problems with the video. So Professor Scheer, let me go to you about that.
Okay, so, I think you've said so many important things. I want to go back for a minute because Mr. Rottenthaler has said has to do with separation from a loved one. And separation is, we have a biological reaction to separation, which is to the anxiety that he's describing again. And it actually has physiologic effects that maybe he wasn't even aware of, but they're there. And that's all very natural. And it needs to be acknowledged. And we need to work to connect, as that's what everyone's been saying. You said it, and Dr. McIntyre said it. We need to feel connected. We need to be connected, and we need to connect in a positive way. Really, we have to. This is a situation that can lend itself to a lot of family conflict, even if you're in the same place, even if you're not separated. We're seeing a lot of domestic conflict in this stressful, very stressful time, and people do pay attention to that. Maybe you need external help. That's another thing that we could talk about, but some kind of teletherapy is available for people. But it's very important to maintain the strength and the positivity in these relationships, and not to get sort of pulled out into the conflict that comes from anxiety. So that gets back to the whole issue of balance, and the balance has to do not only with how much the portion control, which I think is a really wonderful kind of image for this, or metaphor for this, but also making sure that you're building into your life some kinds of positive, pleasurable periods. Yes. And that could be actually, the digital world. It could be watching something that isn't basically the news. It isn't all this, but something that will actually promote positive emotions, because they are a very important part of this mix also. They're part of what helps us stay physically healthy and mentally.
That's true. Let me go to you in Shenzhen. Chen Liang, you want to share your stories and what kinds of support you would like to seek here?
So I kind of want to talk about something I encountered last week at work. So the program I'm working for, the data science program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, just launched a scholarship that is called Medical Personnel Scholarship. And I needed to write a post about it last week. And even though the pandemic is getting controlled pretty well now, and I thought I would be fine looking at those news reports. However, when I searched online and looked back on those news reports, all the kind of anxiety and depressions just flushed back to me. And I think it got probably a little bit worse than when I was under quarantine. So I got really depressed and talked to my friends about it. I think he kind of helped me relieve this emotion, but I'm just a little bit confused actually, because I think I would be fine looking back on those news reports now, but actually I'm not. So that's the kind of help I'm trying to look for. Yeah.
Very interesting. I want to come back to our expert in Calgary. Maybe you can help us to understand better about that. Xiao Miao, if you can. There is a delayed quote-unquote effect. There is also a phenomenon of the more you know, the more in detail you know, and it seems it's getting heavier on you. So, of course, you're talking about the media reports, but I would assume once you know other stories more in details, if you have access to personal stories, you would have similar feelings. So, Xiaomiao, if I can ask you for some advice and also provide your support to what we have just heard, Chen Liang.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think it's also related to the information explosion and nowadays. So when people look at the internet, it's very difficult for them to stop watching the news and stop talking about it. So it's can be a trigger and for people to feel so anxious about it. And because the situation in China is getting better and better, and automatically people started to recover from their previous, like under crisis, we feel it's so scary and I cannot cope with it. But gradually, as the environment is more and more stable, so people started to regain their confidence to feel that, oh, now I have the ability to cope with it. So gradually, we would love to continue to watch some news to keep track of things and keep ourselves updated. But at a certain point, people can be triggered by the news because under the crisis, I always describe it as everyone has an emotional bag. In the crisis, at that moment, we don't have enough time to cope with lots of emotions. It's like a roller coaster, so many feeling scared, feeling anxious, feeling sad. So we don't have time to process those things. We put those emotions in our bags, and gradually we carry those bags with us going through our lives. So at a later point, if there is something that is similar to what happened during the crisis, that could be a trigger. So our emotional bag starts to open and we need to put more things in the bag and we feel, I thought I could handle it, but actually emotionally, I cannot. A discrepancy between our mind, we think we can, but emotionally, there are still things that are there.
What can be done then?
Yeah, so I think one strategy is that we can put a stop sign. Notice our emotion. And it's like if we drive too fast, suddenly there's a stop sign and we can go back to our body, ask ourselves, at this moment, how do I feel? If I feel my anxiety gradually builds up, it's so scary. And I would say to myself, calm down now. And it's okay. I don't read the news at this moment. I can read more in the future, maybe better. But at this time, it's okay to stop.
Well, it's, I think you're coming from the private practice, so I guess that's probably some of the advice you provide to your patients. But what about from researchers' perspective? Professor McIntyre and Professor Scheer, very briefly, if you can, both of you. Professor Scheer, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, we're talking about how do you manage painful emotions that surge up, really intense painful emotions. And it turns out that if you can just kind of take a step back, I think that's what we were just hearing, and name what you're feeling, observe what you're feeling, name what you're feeling. And then from there, you can do things like you can do breathing exercises, you can do physical exercise, helps with acute anxiety because it will lower, even running in place, something like that.
Professor McIntyre?
I agree with my colleague, Dr. Scheer. And in addition to that, I do think, in fact, that we need to put a special emphasis on the importance of sleep and structure. I spoke about that earlier. That's been shown to build resiliency and reduce depression and anxiety. And a concept called behavioral activation. Now, we appreciate that different parts of the world have different restrictions, but simply put, behavioral activation means have a structured day and do things, assign yourself tasks for the day. There's a concept called rumination. And rumination just means we're just marinating negative thoughts over and over and over again. And the more we marinate these thoughts, the more it makes us down and depressed and anxious and exhausted. And behavioral activation, as well as structuring your day, are tactics that can actually sort of work as a brake against that rumination and try to shift your focus on what we heard earlier from Dr. Scheer, on the here and now. And also, at the same time, be left, try to find opportunities to do altruistic actions for your friends, your colleagues, your loved ones, your older parents, and so on, because that also, in fact, takes the shift away from what we call self-reflection, and often it's very negative,
Right.
and often you can just direct that outward. So I really feel, in fact, strongly about the exercise piece, which came up, the sleep, the structure, and behavioral activation.
Got it. And also we have Eli Zhang coming to us, joining us from Tampa, Florida. Eli, what about your story?
So I was actually in China for several months, and I was about to, spend the Chinese New Year with my family. But then my friends has been like constantly reminding me, this pandemic is getting worse and worse. So better you change your flight ticket. So I finally changed my flight ticket, and then the second day of that change, I realized my original flight was canceled. And then the next day, I think the U.S. government announced that they're barring flights from China to the U.S. So I was one of the lucky ones who can make it back to the United States. So I work in a newsroom, and we have been starting to work from home since early March. One of my frustrations is that every day I just need to type so much. We use a software called Slack. I think it's kind of like Ding Ding in China. So a lot of the times, when we communicate things over text, it's just so hard to say things clearly. And then a lot of the times, if you have facial expression or gesture, it's easier for the other to actually get your message. But with texting,
Absolutely.
it's hard. And then it can create a lot of confusion. And sometimes I would feel very upset. Why do you not say thank you to me? Or but actually that person is appreciative, I'm pretty sure. So what I've been doing is just, doing video calls with my team more often. And just doing more video calls and try to talk, using voice. Yeah.
So you think that even though there are tools that we can use, for example, at the time of social distancing, digital tools that are working very well, but still it cannot match the human-to-human interaction, right? So you're trying to make it up through various means, whether it's video conferencing or talking on the phone.
Yeah.
Would that help?
Yeah,
You think
definitely.
that's going to change a lot?
Well, I think the more I use it, the more I hate it. So that's why the more I'm doing video calls. But I think I'm one of the lucky people that come. I have a dog, so that I can have some kind of connection at home, even though I work alone. Yeah.
Can he say hi or she say hi to all of us? What is his or her
Go.
name?
Say hi.
Yay!
Go.
Yay! I'll just go. Okay.
Yeah.
Doggy. That's how to translate into Chinese. Good.
Yes.
Wow. There we go. You got some care and also love over there from Go. Yeah. So I want our psychologists that are watching this to comment on that. Professor McIntyre.
Sorry, the comment on I didn't get the audio piece. Can you say it again?
Eli is very happy because he is with his dog, Go. So what he's trying to say is new tools, even though fascinating, not necessarily help. We have to go back to some traditional, interaction, whether on the phone or seeing on video conferencing. And the most important thing, have your pet. That's what he's trying to do. Professor McIntyre, of course, that's his version. What do you think?
Well, I think that he's right. I think we, unfortunately for many people, they don't have the opportunity to meet friends in person for a variety of restrictions that are in place. And not everyone has broadband and adequately functioning Wi-Fi. So we need to be very careful about that. There's a large part of our population that has no access to this around the world. But that all being said, absolutely, there's a there's a very robust literature around so-called pet therapy and being with companions like that. And absolutely, I think that as human beings, we like to attach. That's how we're wired. It's how we've evolved to attach. And I think that, I think that for most people, a cat or a dog may not be enough, or some other animal. But I'm somewhat biased. I worked for a long time with young children, and often with young children, other populations, pet therapy was a wonderful way to facilitate their communication about their emotion.
Yes.
So I think my colleague's correct.
Yeah. And Professor Scheer, final words from you also about Eli and his love, a go-go.
I totally, of course, agree with everything that has been said about this. It's wonderful. I'm actually a dog person myself.
Yeah, well, there you go. You got the common language over there. I want to thank every one of you. Time is limited for just a discussion of 45 minutes, but I'm sure our interactions with one another can continue. And this is what we've been talking about, human-to-human direct interactions and bounds. And that will keep us go through this very difficult times. I want to thank you for your support once again. And that is all the time we have for today on this very special production. And that's all we have for our special episode of Frontline, a virtual town hall of pandemic and mental health impact. Thanks for watching, and do tune in tomorrow at 22:15 Beijing time for World Insight on CGTN. We're going to air a edited version of this program. That's all we have for today. Bye for now. Be well.